I've never confused kindness with weakness. That misconception usually belongs to people who don't know how to tell the difference between generosity and submission. I do. I always have. My life, before Maribel Knox entered it, was not chaotic. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't lonely enough to require rescue. It was deliberate. I lived alone by choice, not because I lacked companionship, but because I preferred silence that wasn't strained. My apartment reflected that preference. Clean lines, neutral colors, nothing ornamental that didn't serve a purpose. Everything in my space had been earned or chosen intentionally. Nothing had been begged for. Nothing had been borrowed. That included peace. When people talk about opening their door to someone, they often dramatize it, as if generosity happens in moments of emotional weakness. That wasn't the case with me. I didn't meet Maribel during a low point. I didn't save her from the wreckage of my own life. I wasn't searching for connection or validation. I met her because she was adjacent. We shared a professional circle at first, overlapping schedules, mutual acquaintances, proximity without intimacy. She was always present without being central, observant without being loud. I noticed her because she noticed everything. That kind of attention reads as intelligence to me. The first real conversation we had wasn't confessional. It was transactional. We were waiting for the same delayed meeting to begin, seated beside each other in a hallway that smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee and impatience. She commented on the inefficiency of the scheduling system. I agreed. We exchanged dry humor. It was efficient. Clean. She asked what I did. I answered plainly. No embellishment. What made you so organized? She asked, glancing at my notes. Experience, I almost said. Discipline. Survival. Instead, I said, I don't like improvising my stability. She smiled at that. Not broadly. Not theatrically. The smile of someone who had just learned something useful. People think trust begins with warmth. It doesn't. It begins with recognition. Maribel recognized that I was self-contained. She also recognized that self-contained people can be opened carefully if approached with patience instead of force. We didn't become friends quickly. That matters. Our conversations grew gradually, measured disclosures, parallel observations, mutual respect. She didn't rush intimacy. She didn't overshare. She didn't demand emotional access. She waited. That's why I never suspected her. The night she first came to my apartment, it wasn't framed as desperation. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She didn't beg. She explained her situation calmly, with an efficiency I respected. Her lease had ended abruptly. A miscalculation. A roommate who had exited without warning. Temporary instability. I'll find something, she said. I just need a few weeks. I studied her as she spoke. Her posture was controlled. Her tone steady. No manipulation visible. She didn't flatter me. She didn't invoke sisterhood or obligation. I don't respond to theatrics. I respond to composure. You can stay here, I said. Short term. She exhaled once. Quietly. Relief, not celebration. Thank you, she said. I won't make it difficult. That sentence was important. It implied awareness, boundaries, respect. I believed it. Living with someone reveals things quickly. Habits, assumptions, expectations. Maribel was careful in those early weeks. She cleaned without being asked. She kept to herself. She expressed gratitude without excess. She observed my routines and adapted to them instead of disrupting them. She learned when I preferred silence. She learned when I worked late. She learned when I didn't want conversation. And I noticed something else. She remembered everything. Not in a casual way. Not the forgetful, charming recollection people use to appear attentive. She remembered specifics. Dates. Phrasing. Emotional inflections. She remembered stories I told once and never repeated. She recalled details with unsettling accuracy. At the time, I interpreted this as respect. In retrospect, it was inventory. I didn't share my past quickly. That's another misconception people make about me, that I'm guarded because I'm afraid. I'm guarded because I understand cost. Information is leverage. Vulnerability is currency. I don't spend either recklessly. But proximity erodes caution. Shared kitchens. Shared mornings. The casual intimacy of space dissolves defenses faster than emotion ever could. Maribel never pushed. She waited for openings. A question here, a quiet observation there, a mirror held up gently. You carry yourself like someone who's already survived something, she said once, neutral, almost academic. I didn't answer. She didn't press. That restraint built trust faster than any confession could have. When she struggled financially, she didn't dramatize it. She mentioned it once. Then again, later, more factually. I offered help before she asked. Covered utilities, groceries, small expenses that accumulate without announcement. She accepted without pride or protest. I'll pay you back, she said. I nodded. I didn't need repayment. I needed clarity. Weeks turned into months. She found work, first unstable, then promising. I helped when asked, reviewed applications, made introductions, gave advice without sugarcoating. She listened closely. Took notes. You're good at this, she said once. At seeing systems. Yes, I replied. I had to be. That was the first crack. Not because I said too much, but because she heard the implication and stored it. The night I told her about my trauma, it wasn't impulsive. It was late. The apartment was quiet. The city outside muted by rain. We were sitting at opposite ends of the couch, not touching. I spoke slowly, carefully. I chose language that revealed truth without spectacle. I told her what had shaped me, not all of it. Just enough to explain my boundaries. She didn't interrupt. Didn't react dramatically. Didn't rush to reassure. She listened like a professional. When I finished, she said only one thing. That explains a lot. Not sympathy. Not pity. Understanding. That should have been my second warning. Instead, it became the foundation. From that night forward, something shifted, not in our behavior, but in her perception of me. The questions changed. The framing adjusted. She began referring to my resilience with qualifiers. You're strong, considering what you've been through. It makes sense you'd be cautious. You've had to protect yourself more than most. They sounded affirming. They were categorizing. I didn't object. I should have. People like Maribel don't attack first. They annotate. They define. They shape the narrative quietly so that when it's repeated later, it sounds authoritative. At that stage, I still believed the story we were living was mutual. I had no idea she was already rewriting it. I didn't wake up one morning feeling used. That's not how this kind of betrayal works. It doesn't arrive with alarm bells or dramatic shifts. It seeps in through familiarity, through repetition, through the quiet assumption that what was once offered freely is now expected without discussion. By the third month Maribel lived with me, my apartment no longer felt like a favor I was extending. It felt like a resource she had learned how to navigate efficiently. That distinction matters. The bills were the first thing to change, not in amount, but in language. At first, I covered utilities because it made sense. One person more doesn't double electricity, and I didn't want to recalibrate my routines over something minor. She acknowledged it, thanked me, promised repayment when she stabilized. Then, when became vague, I'll get you next month. I just need to get through this pay cycle. I don't want to touch my savings yet. Each explanation was reasonable on its own. That's the trick. Predators of goodwill don't start with unreasonable demands. They normalize dependency by stacking justifications that sound practical. I noticed when the gratitude disappeared. Not immediately. Not abruptly. It faded. The thank yous softened into nods. The nods into assumptions. Eventually, the topic wasn't addressed at all. The bills simply arrived and I paid them. She didn't ask. She didn't mention them. She didn't offer partial contributions. Silence is a language. She was fluent. Groceries followed the same pattern. At first, she contributed occasionally. Items she liked, specialty things. Then the fridge filled with food she consumed and never replaced. I didn't comment. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I was measuring behavior. I wanted to see if she would correct herself. She didn't. Instead, she became more comfortable, more expansive. She took up space differently. Longer showers, louder phone calls, personal items creeping into common areas. Not intrusive, just claiming. I didn't confront her because nothing she did was overt enough to justify a conversation. That's another thing people misunderstand about situations like this. They imagine clear moments where the line is crossed. There aren't lines. There's erosion. The real shift came when she began outsourcing her emotional regulation to me without asking. She would come home from work visibly agitated and sit across from me, waiting. Not requesting support, waiting for it. If I didn't engage immediately, she'd sigh, pace, make noise. Rough day, she'd say eventually. If I didn't respond the way she wanted, she'd escalate. You don't seem very present today. I guess I'll just deal with it myself. It was subtle, strategic, designed to make me feel inattentive without accusing me of anything. So I listened. I advised. I steadied. I did it because I am competent under pressure, and she presented herself as someone who benefited from that competence. I did not yet understand that she was studying how much emotional labor I would provide without being asked. The career assistant started the same way. She mentioned dissatisfaction with her role. I offered perspective. She asked questions. I answered. She brought home drafts of her resume and I edited them, not superficially but structurally. I reframed her experience, refined her language, positioned her strengths. She watched carefully. How did you know to phrase it like that? She asked once. Because people read for confidence, not truth, I said. She nodded. Stored it. I introduced her to 2 contacts. Both were deliberate decisions. I don't pass names casually. I vouched for her. I told people she was capable, adaptable, promising. They trusted my judgment. That trust mattered. She landed an interview quickly, then another, then an offer. She came home glowing, energized in a way I hadn't seen before. I couldn't have done this without you, she said. That was true. And temporary. The first time I noticed the narrative shifting was at a small gathering. Nothing formal, just overlapping acquaintances. Someone congratulated her on the new role and mentioned my name in passing. She really helped me get there, Maribel said, smiling. But I think I needed the push more than anything. The phrasing caught my attention. Help had become a push. Support reframed as encouragement. My role minimized without being denied. I didn't correct it. Not publicly. I watched her face as she spoke, calm, confident, already inhabiting the story she preferred. That night, I asked casually, "Do you feel settled now?" She hesitated. "I'm getting there," she said. "I just want to make sure I'm not being held back." By whom? Was my first thought. But I didn't ask. Instead, I said, "Held back by what?" She shrugged. "You know, environment, energy, old patterns." I made a mental note. People don't accuse directly when they're still laying groundwork. They speak in abstractions so nothing can be challenged. Her spending habits changed next. Better clothes. New devices. Subscriptions she hadn't mentioned before. None of it came with conversation. None of it included repayment. I didn't need the money. That wasn't the issue. What unsettled me was her assumption that my support was infinite. One evening, I returned home later than usual to find her on the couch, legs tucked under her, using my laptop. She looked up when I entered, unfazed. "Hey," she said. "Hope you don't mind. I needed something faster." I did mind. Not because of the laptop, but because she hadn't asked. She'd already decided access was implied. "Next time, ask," I said calmly. She blinked, surprised. "Oh," she said lightly. "Of course. I just didn't think." "That's the problem," I replied. "You didn't—" She laughed it off, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not offense. Calculation. That night she didn't speak much. The silence was intentional. A test. I didn't fill it. The following week, she stopped contributing entirely. No offers. No mentions. No explanations. When I paid the rent, she said nothing. When I bought groceries, she consumed them without comment. Entitlement had settled in. And still, I didn't confront her. People assume silence is weakness. In my case, it's analysis. I wanted to see what she would do once she believed she had secured her position. Whether she would correct herself, whether gratitude would return unprompted. It didn't. Instead, she began asserting independence in a way that subtly diminished my role. "I think I did this on my own," she said one night, scrolling through her phone. "You can't rely on people forever." I looked at her. "No," I agreed. "You can't." She smiled, satisfied, unaware that the sentence had landed differently for me than she intended. Soon after, I discovered she had shared one of my professional contacts with someone else, without telling me. She'd positioned herself as the connector, the gatekeeper. I didn't object. I documented. The final moment of this act, the point where generosity officially transformed into access, came quietly. I received an email from one of the people I'd introduced her to. Casual. Polite. Just checking in, he wrote. Maribel mentioned you've been going through a lot lately. Hope everything's okay. I read the line twice. She hadn't said anything overt. She'd implied concern. Concern framed as information. I closed my laptop and sat still for a long time. That was when I understood something fundamental. Maribel no longer saw me as the person who helped her. She saw me as context, background, explanatory material, a narrative device. And once someone begins turning you into a story they control, generosity becomes liability. That was the moment I stopped offering anything freely. She didn't notice right away, but she would. I didn't confess my trauma because I needed absolution. That's the mistake people make when they hear the word trauma. They imagine confession as collapse, disclosure as desperation. That night was neither. I wasn't unraveling. I wasn't seeking rescue. I was explaining architecture. Some damage doesn't bruise the surface. It restructures the foundation. If you don't understand the structure, you misinterpret the behavior. I wanted her to understand me well enough not to misread my boundaries as cruelty or my silence as indifference. I believed accuracy would protect me. The evening unfolded without ceremony. No wine. No mood lighting. No dramatic preface. The rain had been steady since late afternoon, a thin, disciplined sound against the windows that made the apartment feel sealed off from the city. Maribel sat on one end of the couch, legs folded neatly beneath her, phone face down on the cushion. I noticed that detail. She wanted me to see that she was present. I stood at the counter for a moment longer than necessary, rinsing a mug that didn't need it, deciding whether this conversation was useful. I don't tell stories unless they serve a purpose. You've asked me before why I don't improvise my life, I said finally, turning to face her. This is why. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She didn't encourage. She waited. I sat across from her, not beside her. Distance matters when you're giving someone a map to your internal layout. When I was 19, I learned what it feels like to be erased while still standing. That sentence wasn't rehearsed. It was precise. I told her about the house first, the one that looked respectable from the street. Brick, facade, trim lawn, neighbors who waved and never asked questions. I told her about how safety can be performative, how appearances lull people into trust they haven't earned. I told her about my stepfather's rules. Not shouted rules. Not violent ones. The quiet kind that rearrange your nervous system because they're enforced through consequence rather than force. Don't contradict. Don't draw attention. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. I explained how discomfort was framed as a moral failing. How any emotional reaction that complicated the atmosphere was treated as selfishness. How silence was rewarded. How compliance was praised. I didn't say abuse yet. I said training. She leaned forward slightly then. Interest sharpened. I told her about the night the training escalated, about the kitchen light left on too long, about the sound of my name spoken in a tone that made my stomach drop before my brain understood why, about being told I was misinterpreting what was happening even as it was happening. Gaslighting isn't dramatic in the moment, it's procedural. I described how denial is introduced early, before resistance forms, how language is weaponized to preempt protest. You're sensitive. You misunderstand tone. You read too much into things. I told her about the first time I tried to articulate what felt wrong, and how quickly it was reframed as accusation. How I learned that speaking created problems faster than it solved them. I told her about the body response. The way your muscles tense without instruction. The way your breath shortens when a certain footstep crosses the threshold. The way your pulse spikes at the sound of keys even years later. These aren't metaphors. They're symptoms. I explained the math of it. How constant vigilance becomes default. How you learn to scan faces for micro-expressions. To anticipate moods. To adjust tone before conflict arrives. How you become very good at managing other people's emotional states because it's safer than managing your own. She was watching closely now. Not sympathetically. Attentively. I told her about the moment I realized I couldn't rely on authority to intervene. about the counselor who nodded and asked careful questions and then suggested family therapy, about how neutrality, when misapplied, becomes complicity. I told her about leaving, about the night I packed a bag without waking anyone, about the way the door sounded when it closed behind me, not dramatic, not cinematic, just final. I didn't cry while I spoke. I don't when I'm explaining something that's already been metabolized. Tears are for things that still have sharp edges. This story didn't. I explained what came after, the rebuilding phase, the hyper-competence, the obsession with structure, the way I learned to control my environment, because unpredictability felt like threat. I told her about the diagnosis, not named in the way people expect. Not post-traumatic stress in its sensationalized form, but a quieter constellation of symptoms, hypervigilance, dissociation under prolonged stress, difficulty trusting authority figures who conflate charm with safety. I explained why I don't argue loudly, why I disengage instead of escalating, why I am intolerant of emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Once you understand the mechanics, I said, you don't romanticize chaos anymore. She finally spoke then. That explains why you don't let people get close quickly. Yes, I said. And why I notice shifts in behavior before others do. She nodded slowly, as if aligning puzzle pieces. What about relationships? She asked. Romantic ones. I considered whether that question was necessary. I decided it was adjacent. I told her about the pattern I avoided, about the kind of person who mistakes emotional access for ownership, about how I learned early that intimacy without respect is just proximity with consequences. I didn't tell her names. I didn't tell her details that could be verified. I kept the story informational, not anecdotal. I believed that would limit misuse. I was wrong. She thanked me after I finished. Not effusively, not dramatically. She said, I appreciate you trusting me with that. I believed her. Because trust, when offered carefully, creates an illusion of control. I thought I had controlled the narrative by choosing what to share and how. I didn't understand that the danger wasn't the content. It was the context. From that night forward, her language shifted. Not abruptly. Gradually. She began referencing my past in ways that framed it as explanation rather than history. It makes sense you'd react that way, given what you've been through. You're probably more sensitive to power dynamics than most people. You've had to protect yourself for so long. These statements sound supportive to outsiders. They aren't. They're diagnostic. They reduce behavior to pathology. They reposition agency as symptom. I corrected her once. I'm not sensitive, I said. I'm accurate. She smiled. Of course. But she didn't stop. I noticed how she began inserting my trauma into conversations where it didn't belong. Not explicitly. Indirectly. As subtext. Alara has high standards, she'd say. But that comes from experience. She's very controlled, she'd add. She's learned to be. The emphasis was subtle, the implication clear. I watched how people responded. How their eyes softened, not with respect, but with condescension. How my decisiveness began to be reinterpreted as rigidity. How my boundaries were reframed as defenses. This is how reputations are dismantled quietly. You don't accuse. You contextualize. You don't lie. You reinterpret. The night I realized she was no longer holding my story carefully came weeks later. We were at a small dinner, nothing formal. A mix of professional acquaintances and friends of friends. Conversation flowed. Wine loosened language. I excused myself briefly, returning to the table in time to hear my name spoken. I just worry about her sometimes, Maribel was saying. Voice low, sincere. She's been through a lot. The table went quiet. Nothing dangerous, she added quickly. Just complex. I sat down. No one looked at me directly. That's the moment you feel the temperature change. Not hostility, caution. People adjusting their perception mid-interaction. I didn't challenge her then. Public confrontation would have validated the implication. Instead, I asked neutrally, worry about me how? She blinked. Just once. Oh, she said lightly. You know, stress, work, history. She smiled as if she'd said something benign. I smiled back. Later that night, alone in my room, I cataloged everything she'd said since my confession. Every reframing, every qualification, every moment where my past had been repositioned as explanation for present behavior. I realized then that I had made a fundamental error. I had assumed that sharing trauma with precision limited its misuse. It doesn't. Precision only makes the weapon sharper. When someone understands not just what hurt you, but how it shaped you, your thresholds, your triggers, your adaptations, they don't need to invent stories. They can simply adjust the angle. That night, I stopped speaking about my past entirely. Not because I was ashamed, because I understood the terrain had changed. Maribel didn't need more information. She already had enough, and she was learning how to deploy it. The first sign wasn't rejection. It was hesitation. People didn't stop responding to me outright. They paused. Emails took longer. Invitations arrived later, sometimes after decisions had already been made. Conversations shifted slightly off-center as if everyone had agreed without telling me to stand one step back. Distance doesn't announce itself. It adjusts the temperature. I noticed it in rooms first. Meetings where I used to speak and be met with engagement now met me with politeness. Heads nodded, but eyes didn't linger. When I made a point, it landed, but without echo. The conversation moved on faster than it used to, as if my contribution had already been accounted for elsewhere. At first, I assumed timing, fatigue, my own reduced patience for noise. I reviewed my behavior clinically, the way I always do when something feels off. I hadn't changed. My standards were consistent, my tone measured, my output solid. So I stopped looking inward. I started looking around. Maribel was still everywhere. Present, helpful, agreeable. She had mastered the art of proximity without visibility, always near the conversation, rarely at the center. The kind of person who knows when to step forward and when to let others speak so she appears supportive rather than ambitious. People like that aren't threatening. They're trusted. I watched how she interacted with others, how she nodded at the right moments, how she framed questions in a way that guided answers, how she positioned herself as someone who noticed things others missed. I recognized the technique. It was the same one she'd used with me. The first concrete fracture came through omission. A project I should have been consulted on moved forward without me. Not maliciously, not obviously. I found out after decisions had already been finalized, my name mentioned only in passing. I assumed you were busy, the coordinator said when I asked. Busy with what? I didn't challenge the assumption. I noted it. Then another meeting. Then another. Each time the explanation was different. Scheduling conflicts, miscommunication, oversight, none of it actionable. All of it cumulative. That's how credibility erodes, not through accusation, but through absence. People stop expecting your presence before they stop trusting you. I asked Jonah Mercer to have coffee with me. Jonah had always been neutral, not particularly close, not distant. Observant, careful with his words, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks and remembers what others forget. We sat across from each other in a place that was quiet enough to discourage performance. I didn't lead with grievance. I led with curiosity. Have you noticed anything different? I asked. He hesitated. Just long enough to matter. Different how? He said. About how people are responding to me. Another pause. He looked at his coffee, then back at me. I wasn't sure it was my place to say anything. That was the sentence. When someone tells you they've been deciding whether to speak, it means they already know something is wrong. Say it, I replied. He exhaled slowly. There's been some concern. Concern about what? He chose his words carefully. About how you're doing. I waited. Emotionally, he added. Professionally. People are worried you might be under more strain than you let on. I felt the room sharpen. Who is people? I asked. He hesitated again. Longer this time. I don't want to misattribute, he said. But it came up after Maribel mentioned you'd been dealing with some heavy things. There it was. Not accusation, not rumor. Concern. Concern is the most effective delivery system for doubt because it sounds benevolent. No one argues with concern without appearing defensive. No one questions concern without seeming dismissive. What did she say exactly? I asked. Jonah frowned. She didn't go into detail. She said you'd been through trauma. that it still affects how you handle stress, that you might be more reactive under pressure. Reactive. I sat back, folding my hands. Did she say I was unstable? I asked. No, he said quickly. She was very careful. She framed it as empathy. Of course she did. Empathy is camouflage. I thanked Jonah and left without discussing it further. There was nothing to confront yet. Nothing concrete. Just implication. And implication is a slow poison. It spreads through interpretation, not fact. I began to hear my own words come back to me altered. Phrases I'd said in confidence resurfaced in softened, distorted forms. Statements about boundaries became evidence of rigidity. Silence became withdrawal. Decisiveness became control. She wasn't inventing behaviors. She was recontextualizing them. And because she knew the origin story, the trauma, the adaptation, the why, it sounded credible. Insightful, even. That's what makes this kind of betrayal so effective. The truth doesn't need to be falsified. It only needs to be framed. The next shift happened socially. People I'd known for years began checking in with me in a way that felt clinical. You seem okay, someone said at a gathering, eyes scanning my face for confirmation. I am okay, I replied. They smiled, relieved, but not reassured. How's your stress level? Another asked casually, as if inquiring about the weather. Normal, I said. Why? Oh, no reason, they replied too quickly. Maribel stood nearby, listening. I caught her eye once during one of these exchanges. She looked concerned, gentle, the picture of care. I understood then that she wasn't just speaking about me. She was performing care for me. That distinction matters. Care invites trust. Trust invites disclosure. Disclosure feeds narrative. The night it became undeniable was unremarkable in every other way. A small dinner. Private home. 8 people. Low light. The kind of environment where people relax their filters. Wine loosened language. Familiarity bred assumption. I excused myself briefly to take a call. When I returned, the conversation faltered. Not abruptly, subtly, like a room adjusting to a new variable. Maribel was mid-sentence. I just think she carries more than most people realize, she was saying. It shows up in how tightly she controls things. No one contradicted her. I sat down calmly. Controls what? I asked. She turned toward me, startled but composed. Oh, she said. I was just saying you're very structured. That's not what you said, I replied. She smiled apologetically. I didn't mean it negatively. Then clarify, I said. The room went quiet. She hesitated. Just a fraction too long. I meant that you've had to protect yourself, she said carefully. So sometimes flexibility is harder. I looked around the table. No one met my eye. That's when I understood the depth of it. They weren't waiting to hear my response. They were waiting to see how I'd react. If I challenged her, I'd confirm the narrative. If I stayed silent, I'd allow it to settle. This is how traps work. Every exit leads to the same conclusion. I see, I said finally. Thank you for sharing your interpretation of me. She flushed slightly. Not with guilt, with irritation. Later that night, I confronted her privately. Not emotionally. Precisely. You've been discussing my trauma with people, I said. She looked genuinely surprised. I've never shared details. You've shared conclusions, I replied. Without context, without consent. She frowned. I was trying to protect you. No, I said. You were defining me. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. Impressive control. I would never hurt you, she said. I care about you too much. That sentence was carefully chosen. Care again. Always care. I need you to stop speaking about my past entirely, I said. She nodded vigorously. Of course. I didn't realize. I don't believe that, I said calmly. But I'm stating the boundary anyway. She went quiet. The next day she escalated, not openly, efficiently. I found out through omission again, this time from Dr. Calloway Renshaw, a person whose opinion carried weight, a person who had always been measured, fair, difficult to sway. He asked to speak with me after a meeting. Are you feeling supported right now? He asked. Yes, I said. Why? He folded his hands. There's been some concern about whether you're taking on too much. Concern again. I manage my workload effectively, I replied. I'm sure you do, he said. But given what I've heard, I waited. It might be wise to ensure you're not underestimating your limits. Who told you I have limits you should be worried about? I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. I left the meeting knowing 3 things with certainty. 1. Maribel had spoken to people she had no authority to speak to. 2. She had framed her interference as care. 3. My name was no longer neutral when it left her mouth. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat at my desk and reviewed everything. Messages, conversations, timelines. Patterns emerged. Every time my authority increased, her concern intensified. Every time I set a boundary, her narrative softened me. Every time I withdrew, she filled the silence with interpretation. She wasn't reacting to me. She was positioning herself relative to me, caretaker to my instability, interpreter of my behavior, buffer between me and others. It was elegant, and it was calculated. The coldest realization came last. She didn't hate me. She needed me diminished. Because as long as I was seen as fragile, she could remain essential. That was the moment my strategy changed. I stopped trying to correct the narrative. I started letting her speak. Because people who weaponize concern eventually contradict themselves. And when they do, the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs time. Silence is often misunderstood. People mistake it for retreat, for confusion, for weakness. They assume that when someone stops responding, stops correcting, stops engaging, it's because they've run out of leverage or clarity. In my case, silence was selection. I stopped speaking because I no longer needed to persuade anyone of anything. The moment I understood that Maribel's narrative relied on my participation, my reactions, my objections, my visible discomfort, I removed myself from the mechanism entirely. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't signal it. I simply withdrew my emotional presence while remaining physically and professionally intact. That distinction is critical. I still showed up. I still worked. I still delivered. But I stopped explaining myself. At first, this confused her. She was used to feedback loops, small calibrations, emotional responses she could measure and adjust to. When I stopped providing those signals, she compensated by increasing her output. Concern became more frequent. Her proximity intensified. Her language softened further. "Have you been sleeping?" she asked one morning, tone deliberately gentle. "Yes," I replied, neutral. "You seem quieter than usual," she added. "I'm focused," I said. She nodded slowly, as if logging the response. She didn't ask again that day. I began documenting everything. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. I noted dates, exact phrasing, who was present, who repeated what later, and how it changed in transit. Patterns become visible when you stop arguing with them. I saved messages, not just hers, but others referencing her concern. Emails that included phrases like "just checking in," "making sure you're supported," "given everything you've been dealing with." None of these messages accused me of anything. That was the brilliance of it. Concern creates plausible deniability. It allows the speaker to retreat at any moment and claim benevolence. But when repeated consistently, across multiple channels, it forms an implication stronger than accusation. I didn't respond defensively. I responded with competence. I increased my output slightly, not dramatically, just enough to establish contrast. I met deadlines early. I clarified decisions succinctly. I documented my work more thoroughly than usual, not to prove myself. To create record, Maribel noticed. She began checking in more frequently, sometimes twice a day. She asked questions she already knew the answers to. She offered help that wasn't needed. She framed my independence as isolation. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said once, voice warm. "I don't," I replied. "I choose when to." That answer unsettled her. She escalated socially next. I learned this not from her, but from the shift in how others spoke to me. Concern became more pointed, less abstract. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," someone said after a meeting I had led flawlessly. "I'm not pushing," I replied. "I'm working." They smiled, unconvinced. Maribel had adjusted her framing. Where she once spoke of my past, she now spoke of my present. She's been under a lot of pressure lately. She doesn't always realize when she's taking on too much. She's so capable, she forgets to rest. None of this was false. None of it was neutral. I said nothing. Silence creates space for overconfidence. And Maribel, emboldened by my lack of response, began to overstep. The first slip was small. She referenced a conversation we had never had. She told me she's been struggling more than she admits, Maribel said in front of Jonah one afternoon. Jonah looked at me, confused. I met his gaze evenly. I've never said that. Maribel laughed lightly. You didn't say it exactly like that. Then don't paraphrase me, I said. It was the first time I contradicted her publicly. Not emotionally. Factually. She recovered quickly, smiling apologetically. I must have misremembered. But something shifted. Jonah noticed. He didn't say anything then. But later that week, he asked me quietly, "Has she been speaking for you often?" "Yes," I replied. "More recently." He nodded. "That explains a few things." That was the first confirmation that my silence had created visibility. The second slip was larger. Maribel attempted to insert herself into a conversation with Dr. Renshaw that did not involve her. She framed it as advocacy. "I just wanted to make sure Alara wasn't being overwhelmed," she said, according to him. "She doesn't always recognize her limits." This time, he questioned it. "How would you know that?" He asked her. She hadn't anticipated that. She said she'd observed it. That she lived with me. That she cared. Care again. But care, when questioned, requires evidence. She didn't have any. Dr. Renshaw didn't confront me immediately. He waited. Watched. Compared. Weeks passed. My performance remained consistent. My demeanor unchanged. My decisions sound. The concern stopped escalating. Not because it disappeared. Because it stopped aligning with reality. That's when Maribel panicked. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks industrious. She began reaching out to people more frequently. Hosting small gatherings. Positioning herself as connective tissue. She increased her visibility in my orbit, speaking around me even when I was present. She tried to provoke a reaction. "You seem distant," she said one evening at home, eyes searching my face. "Did I do something?" "No," I replied. The lack of elaboration frustrated her. "I just worry that you're shutting people out," she continued. "That's an assumption," I said. "Not a concern." Her jaw tightened. The next day, she crossed a line she couldn't step back from. She told someone, incorrectly, that I had asked her to check in with others on my behalf. That person came to me directly. "Are you okay with Maribel speaking for you?" they asked. "She said you requested it." "No," I said. "I didn't." The pause that followed was heavy. "She was very specific," they added, "about what you're dealing with." "What did she say?" I asked. They hesitated. Then told me, not everything, just enough. She had referenced my trauma again, more explicitly this time. Still without details. Still framed as explanation. I thanked them and ended the conversation. Then I sat down and reviewed my documentation. The timeline was clear now. The escalation coincided with my silence. Her authority increased as my reactions disappeared. Her claims became more specific as her influence was questioned. This was no longer about interpretation. It was about control. I didn't confront her that night. I waited. Because people who lie by implication always reach a point where implication isn't enough, where they feel entitled to speak with certainty. And certainty leaves fingerprints. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A group meeting. Casual setting. No hierarchy. The kind of environment where people speak freely, assuming alignment. Maribel spoke confidently about me, as if I weren't there. "Alara has a lot of insight," she said. "But sometimes her history makes it hard for her to trust people fully." I looked up from my notes. "That's not true," I said. The room went still. She turned to me, startled. "I didn't mean it negatively." "I didn't say you did," I replied. "I said it wasn't true." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "You don't know how I trust," I continued calmly. "And you don't get to define it. No accusation, no emotion. Just correction." She flushed. Afterward, she avoided me. That avoidance lasted 3 days. Then she came home late one night, visibly shaken. "I think people are misinterpreting me," she said. "I was just trying to help." I didn't respond. "Alara," she said sharply. "Say something." I met her eyes. "I'm documenting everything," I said. Her face changed. Not fear. Recognition. She understood then that the game had shifted, that I was no longer unaware. That silence had not been surrender. It had been preparation. She didn't sleep much after that. I knew because she began making mistakes, contradicting herself, repeating stories with different details, speaking too much, too quickly, and people noticed. I didn't need to expose her. I just needed to stop protecting her from herself. Power doesn't shift all at once. It redistributes quietly, the way weight settles in a structure when one support beam is removed. You don't hear the change immediately. You feel it later, when what used to hold suddenly doesn't. After I told Maribel I was documenting everything, I didn't change my behavior. That part was important. People expect retaliation to be dramatic. They expect confrontation, ultimatums, emotional spillover. I gave her none of that. I kept the same schedule. I maintained the same tone. I treated her with the same level of courtesy I would give a colleague I no longer trusted. Courtesy without warmth is disorienting. It removes intimacy without signaling hostility, which leaves the other person unsure how to respond. Maribel tried several approaches in quick succession, each revealing more about her dependence than she intended. First, she tried charm. She cooked dinner one night, something she hadn't done in weeks. She set the table carefully, lit a candle, played music she knew I liked. "I thought we could reset," she said, smiling. "Things have felt tense." I ate. I thanked her. I didn't comment on the atmosphere. "Tense how?" I asked. She faltered. "You know, quiet." "I've always been quiet," I replied. The candle burned down without serving its purpose. Next, she tried vulnerability. A few nights later, she knocked on my door after midnight. Not frantic. Controlled distress. The kind that invites concern without demanding it. "I'm scared," she said. "I feel like people are turning on me." I considered the phrasing. People weren't turning on her. They were noticing her. "What are you scared of?" I asked. She swallowed. That I might have said something wrong. That my intentions are being misunderstood. I said nothing. Silence has weight when you stop cushioning it. "I never meant to hurt you," she added quickly. "You know that, right?" "I know what you've done," I replied. "Intentions are irrelevant." Her eyes widened slightly. That wasn't the response she'd rehearsed. She retreated after that, but not completely. She needed access. She always had. Access was how she regulated her position. Meanwhile, my life began recalibrating in ways she couldn't touch. Dr. Renshaw requested a follow-up meeting. This time, he came prepared, not with concern, but with data. Performance metrics, timelines, deliverables, evidence that contradicted the narrative that had been quietly circulating. "I've been comparing notes," he said. "And I wanted to hear directly from you." I didn't defend myself. I explained my work, line by line, decision by decision, without reference to Maribel, without reference to rumors. I didn't need to disprove anything. I simply replaced implication with fact. By the end of the meeting, his posture had changed. "There seems to have been some overinterpretation," he said carefully. "Yes," I replied. "There has." He nodded. "That won't be an issue going forward." It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. That was enough. As professional confidence returned, social dynamics adjusted in parallel. People began re-engaging with me, not effusively but normally. Invitations resumed. Conversations relaxed. The careful distance softened into something closer to neutrality. Maribel felt it immediately. She had always relied on contrast, her concern against my supposed fragility. Without fragility, she had no role. Her presence began to feel excessive. Her check-ins unnecessary. Her commentary intrusive. She noticed the shift and panicked. Dependency doesn't disappear when it's exposed. It intensifies. She began asking for reassurance explicitly. "Are we okay?" she asked one evening, standing too close in the kitchen. "Yes," I said. The word frustrated her because it offered no leverage. "You don't sound okay," she pressed. "I sound accurate," I replied. She backed away, unsettled. Then came the requests. Small at first. "Could you look over this email before I send it? Do you think this tone is right? Can you introduce me to someone else you know in that space?" I declined each one politely. "I'm not available for that. I don't have capacity. I'm not making introductions right now." Each refusal was calm, unemotional, final. She took them personally anyway. That's another misconception people have, that boundaries provoke conflict because they're aggressive. They don't. They provoke conflict because they remove utility. Maribel had built her position on proximity to my competence. Without that proximity, she had to stand on her own. And she wasn't as solid as she'd believed. Mistakes began surfacing. Small inconsistencies, miscommunications, overpromising followed by under-delivering. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to erode the trust she'd borrowed from association with me. People who rise too quickly without internal structure tend to wobble when left unsupported. She came home one afternoon visibly agitated, pacing instead of sitting. "They're questioning me," she said, "about things I've said, about what I know. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. They asked if I was speaking on your behalf," she continued. "I told them I wasn't." "Were you?" I asked. She stopped pacing. "I was just interpreting," she said. "Interpretation is speaking," I replied. "Especially when it carries consequence." She stared at me, searching for something. Anger, reassurance, anything she could use. I gave her nothing. That night, she made a decision that accelerated her own undoing. She attempted to confront Jonah. I learned about it the next day. "She asked me why I'd been distant," he said. "Then she implied you'd said something about her." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "That you hadn't," he replied, "and that her version of events didn't match mine." He paused. "She didn't like that." "No, she wouldn't have. Because Jonah represented something she couldn't manipulate easily, an external witness with no emotional investment in either of us." From that point on, the narrative she'd been managing began to fracture. Different versions reached different people. Timelines didn't align. Her explanations became longer, more elaborate. When people ask for clarification, liars often provide too much of it. I remained consistent. When asked, I spoke plainly. When questioned, I answered directly. When misunderstood, I clarified once, and only once. Consistency doesn't shout. It stabilizes. The final shift, the moment she realized she no longer had leverage, came quietly. She asked me one night if I planned to renew the living arrangement. "No," I said. She blinked. "Because of everything that's happened?" "Because it no longer serves me," I replied. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, voice tight. I met her gaze. "That's not my responsibility." That sentence ended something in her. Not the friendship. The illusion. She had mistaken my generosity for obligation, my silence for tolerance, my past for permission. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify the decision. I didn't negotiate. She moved out 2 weeks later. Quietly. Quickly. Without drama. That, more than anything else, told me she understood. People who believe they still have influence fight to keep it. People who know they've lost it retreat to preserve what little narrative they have left. After she left, my apartment returned to its original state. Clean, ordered, intentional. So did my life. The difference was internal. I no longer felt the need to monitor the environment for distortion. I wasn't tracking whispers or reading between lines. The air had cleared, not because the story had been corrected publicly, but because it no longer needed correction. Truth stabilizes itself when lies are deprived of oxygen. Maribel attempted one last reach, a message, late at night. I never meant for things to turn out this way. I read it once. Then I archived it. Because meaning is irrelevant when impact has already occurred. The leverage had changed hands not because I'd taken anything from her, but because I'd stopped giving her access to what wasn't hers to use. And that, I learned, is the most definitive form of power. By the time things began to collapse around Maribel, I had already stepped out of the frame. That part confuses people when they hear this story later. They expect a reveal, a confrontation, A moment where I lay everything out and reclaim my name in a dramatic sweep. They imagine vindication as spectacle. They misunderstand the mechanics. Spectacle requires energy. Energy implies investment. And I had already divested. The unraveling didn't begin with accusation. It began with silence. Mine, and then others. Invitations she once received without effort stopped arriving. Conversations she used to lead began to move past her. The small validations she depended on, nods, agreement, affirmation, thinned out. She noticed. Of course she did. People who survive on proximity to power always notice when it shifts away from them. What she didn't notice was how carefully the ground had been prepared beneath her feet. I hadn't corrected the narrative publicly, but I had replaced it privately. In quiet conversations. In measured responses. Inconsistency that left no room for interpretation. When people asked, because eventually they always do, I didn't defend myself. I didn't mention her. I answered questions about my work, my decisions, my boundaries. I spoke as if nothing unusual had ever happened. That was the most destabilizing part for her. Because concern narratives need contrast. They need visible fragility, defensiveness, or reactivity to justify themselves. Without that, they begin to sound unanchored, like stories told too often without proof. The first crack appeared in a meeting I wasn't even present for. Jonah told me about it afterward. He described it carefully, as if choosing his words might still influence the outcome. She contradicted herself, he said, about something small. But it stood out. What? I asked. She said you'd asked her to step in for you during a decision-making process, he replied. Then, later in the same conversation, she said she took initiative because you were overwhelmed. Those are mutually exclusive explanations. In isolation, either might pass. Together, they don't. People didn't confront her immediately. That's another misconception. Truth doesn't rush to correct falsehoods. It waits until falsehoods overextend. And Maribel was overextending. She had grown accustomed to speaking for me, to interpreting my actions, to positioning herself as intermediary between me and others. Without my reactions to calibrate against, she began to speak with too much certainty. Certainty is dangerous when it isn't earned. The second crack appeared socially. She attempted to preempt a question by answering it before it was asked. She's doing well now, she told a small group, referring to me. But she still has moments. Moments of what? The silence that followed her statement was uncomfortable. Someone shifted in their chair. What moments? A woman asked. Maribel hesitated. Oh, she said lightly, you know. Stress, trust issues. Based on what? The woman pressed. That was new. Maribel laughed, a touch too loudly. I live with her. Or, I used to. The woman frowned. Used to? Yes, Maribel said quickly. We've both been very busy. The conversation moved on, but the impression lingered. People don't forget inconsistencies when they're presented casually. They store them, file them away, compare them later. The third crack, the one that mattered, came professionally. Dr. Renshaw requested a clarification, not from me. From her? He asked her to explain her role in several conversations she had referenced, and to provide context for claims she'd made about my availability and capacity. It was framed neutrally, procedurally. No accusation. She wasn't prepared. She offered generalities, concern, proximity, care. None of it answered the questions. When pressed for specifics, dates, examples, direct statements, she faltered. I didn't document it, she said. It was more observational. Observation without corroboration is opinion. And opinion, when it carries professional consequence, requires accountability. Dr. Renshaw didn't reprimand her. He didn't need to. He thanked her for her time and closed the matter. But something shifted after that. I noticed it in how people spoke to me. The cautious phrasing disappeared. The clinical tone softened. The questions stopped orbiting my emotional state and returned to my work. That's how you know a narrative has lost credibility, not when it's challenged, but when it's abandoned. Maribel felt it immediately. She began reaching out to me again, not for reconciliation, but for alignment. We should talk, she said in one message. I feel like things are being misunderstood. I didn't reply. She tried again. I think there's confusion we could clear up together. Together. That word revealed everything. She needed me visible again. Needed proximity to stabilize her version of events. Needed my presence to lend legitimacy to her concern. I didn't give it. Her final attempt was indirect. She told someone I trusted that she was worried I might be cutting people off because of fear. That person came to me directly. "Is that true?" they asked. "No," I said. "I'm choosing carefully." They nodded. "That tracks." 2 words, but decisive. That was when I understood the collapse was complete. Not because Maribel had been exposed publicly, but because no one needed to ask me about her anymore. Her words had lost authority. Her interpretations no longer carried weight. She became background noise. The last time I saw her was unplanned. We crossed paths in a neutral space, no audience, no agenda. She looked different. Not physically, energetically, smaller, less certain. She hesitated when she saw me, as if unsure which version of herself to present. "Ilara," she said. I stopped. Not because I owed her anything, but because I was curious what she would do without leverage. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quickly. "Things just spiraled." "They didn't spiral," I replied. "They progressed." She swallowed. "I was trying to help." "No," I said calmly. "You were trying to matter." The words landed harder than anger ever could have. "I cared about you," she insisted. "I know," I said. "That's what made it dangerous." She looked at me then, not with resentment, but with something closer to recognition. "You could have ruined me," she said quietly. "I didn't need to," I replied. I turned and walked away. That was the end of it. Not because she apologized, not because I forgave her, but because the truth no longer required my participation to stand. People often ask me afterward if it felt satisfying. It didn't. It felt clarifying. I learned that betrayal doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from need, unmanaged, unexamined need that mistakes proximity for entitlement and empathy for permission. I learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, exposes far more than confrontation ever could. And I learned that the most effective form of vindication is not reclaiming your name loudly, but watching it settle back into place on its own, steady, intact, unquestioned. By the time Maribel's story collapsed, I was already living in the aftermath, unbothered, unattached, unreachable. I didn't walk away from that experience believing people were dangerous. That would have been too easy, too convenient, too clean. Blaming people absolves you from the harder work of discernment. It lets fear masquerade as wisdom. I wasn't interested in that trade. What I walked away with was something quieter and far more durable: precision. The kind that lets you tell the difference between genuine connection and strategic closeness. The kind that notices when curiosity turns into inventory. The kind that understands that access is earned continuously, not granted once and assumed forever. After Maribel left, the apartment stayed silent for several days. Not the charged silence of aftermath, but the neutral kind. The kind that doesn't ask anything of you. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't replace her presence with noise or company or explanations. I let the space return to its original function. Shelter, focus, clarity. I reorganized without ceremony. Not as a symbolic purge, but as maintenance. Items she'd left behind were boxed and labeled. No anger attached, no sentiment, just order restored. That was the pattern that defined the months that followed. Restore, refine, reclaim. I didn't announce anything publicly. No declarations, no subtweets, no coded messages disguised as empowerment. I didn't need witnesses to validate what had already been resolved internally. People noticed the shift anyway, not because I spoke about it, but because I stopped adjusting myself to accommodate other people's discomfort. I stopped softening statements preemptively. I stopped explaining boundaries as if they were requests. When I said no, it stood alone. When I said yes, it was intentional. That recalibration changed my relationships, not by reducing them, but by clarifying them. Some people drifted. That was expected. Access without entitlement doesn't appeal to everyone. Others leaned in, carefully, respectfully. Without urgency, those were the ones I paid attention to. I want to be clear about something, because stories like this often get flattened into cautionary tales that end in isolation. I did not close myself off to friendship. I kept my mind open. Not optimistically, not defensively, intelligently. I still believe in genuine connection. I still value intimacy. I still make space for people who show consistency over performance, curiosity without extraction, and care without control. The difference now is that I don't confuse intensity with intimacy or vulnerability with trust. Trust is cumulative. It is built in moments that don't benefit the other person. It is revealed in how someone speaks about you when you're not present. It is confirmed by whether they respect boundaries, even when doing so costs them proximity. I no longer offer the benefit of the doubt as a substitute for observation. That doesn't make me cynical. It makes me accurate. There were invitations after Maribel, friendships that began slowly, without spectacle, conversations that unfolded without urgency, people who didn't need to know everything about me to treat me with respect. Those friendships felt different, quieter, safer, less extractive. They didn't require me to narrate my past to justify my present. They didn't need my trauma as context for my boundaries. They didn't interpret my silence. They listened when I spoke. They accepted when I didn't. And that was enough. Occasionally, someone would ask about Maribel, not directly, indirectly, with curiosity framed as concern. Are you still friends? What happened there? I answered honestly and briefly. No, we diverged. I didn't explain further. Some stories don't need retelling to retain their meaning. I thought often about the version of myself who opened the door to her. Not with regret, but with respect. That woman wasn't foolish. She was generous in a world that often rewards extraction. She was open in a culture that mistakes access for entitlement. She believed that shared space could become shared integrity. She wasn't wrong. She was just early. If you've been betrayed by a friend, truly betrayed, not disappointed, not misunderstood, there's a particular grief that comes with that. It's not the loss of the person. It's the loss of the reality you thought you were living in. The realization that someone studied you not to understand you, but to use you. That grief doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly in your body. It alters how you scan rooms. It changes how quickly you offer warmth. It makes you question your judgment more than theirs. Here's what I want you to hear, clearly and without comfort padding. Being betrayed by a friend does not mean you are bad at choosing people. It means you are capable of intimacy. And intimacy is not a flaw. What matters is what you do after. Do you close yourself off and call it wisdom? Or do you refine your boundaries and call it growth? I chose refinement. I chose to remain open, not to everyone but to the right people. I chose discernment over defensiveness, clarity over bitterness, standards over suspicion. And that choice has shaped a life that feels not smaller, but stronger. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Not everyone who sits at your table deserves to know how the house was built. Some people only want the address so they can redirect the mail. You are allowed to protect your inner architecture. You are allowed to change access levels without explanation. You are allowed to walk away without proving harm. And you are allowed, always, to believe that better connections exist without having to rush toward them. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the quiet parts, the restrained parts, the moments where silence did more than shouting, then I want you to do something intentional. Share this with someone who's questioning their instincts after being betrayed by a friend. Like this story if it reminded you that boundaries are not cruelty. Subscribe if you want more stories that don't romanticize suffering but respect survival. Because healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like accuracy. And accuracy, when practiced consistently, changes everything. Being betrayed by a friend doesn't mean you trusted the wrong person. It means you trusted deeply. The lesson is not to harden, but to choose more carefully who earns access next.